And now I'm going to share just a very little bit about our guests of honor before they take it away. We have R.L. Stine as moderator today. In addition to scaring us for a lot of years, R.L. Stine is one of the best-selling children's authors in history. Goosebumps, which recently celebrated its 30th anniversary, has more than 350 million English language books in print, plus an additional 50+ million international copies in print in 32 languages. The Goosebumps series made R.L. Stine a worldwide publishing celebrity and Jeopardy answer. Also, the Goosebumps TV series was the #1 children's show in America for 3 years. The episodes can still be seen on Netflix. More recently, R.L.'s anthology TV series, R.L. Stine's The Haunting Hour, won the Emmy Award 3 years in a row as Best Children's Show. His newest Disney Plus TV series is Just Beyond, based on his graphic novels for Boom Studios. 2 Goosebump feature films starring Jack Black as R.L. Stine were released in 2015 and 2018. The first film became the #1 film in America. The Fear Street movies all reached #1 on Netflix. R.L. Stine lives in New York City with his wife, Jane, an editor and publisher. And with us today is author Sebastian Barry. I came across this review quote from the Irish Times that said that one of Sebastian Barry's extraordinary gifts as a writer is his boundless capacity for empathy, for inhabiting the skin, nerves, and mouths of characters the river of history tends to wash away. Sebastian was born in Dublin in 1955. He is the author of 8 previous novels, as well as numerous plays. He is the first novelist to twice win the Costa Book Award of the Year Award for Days Without End and The Secret Scripture, has twice been shortlisted for the Booker Prize for A Long, Long Way and The Secret Scripture, and has twice been longlisted for the Booker Prize for Days Without End and On Cannon's Side. He was the laureate for Irish fiction from 2018 to 2021, and he lives in County Wicklow, Ireland. As I was preparing for tonight, I read the recent New Yorker article by Giles Harvey with a subtitle that reads, "Combining Verbal Exuberance and Narrative Intricacy, Barry reimagines the hauntings of Irish history." With that, let's hear from the authors here with us today. Remember, we will have time for Q&A. RJ Julia, Wesley and RJ Julia, and Bookhampton are so grateful to have Sebastian Barry and R.L. Stine here in conversation today. I'm going to let them get started.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sebastian, I wish you were here in New York.
Well, I'm sort of there.
Sit around and talk.
Spiritually. I'm just beside you, Bob. If you can just turn to your left, you'll see a little shadow.
I can see you
Yes.
perfectly. Yeah, here we are. And
Yeah.
I'm sure there are people out there scratching their heads saying, why on earth would Sebastian Barry talk with R.L. Stine?
Such is love, Bob.
Yes, we've been friends for a long time. And I have to tell about the day, a night after we first met. Sebastian and I actually met in Brisbane, Australia at a book festival. And the night before, Sebastian was talking about his World War I novel, Long, Long Way. And the night before he gave his talk, we were having dinner, and you seemed very nervous. He was very nervous at dinner. He was saying, what am I going to say? Well, how shall I present it? What shall I do? And and we were trying to give him suggestions on what he should say. And he said, well, I want to leave the right impression. I don't want to just stand. And he was we were worried about him. So the next morning we go to this big white tent, and where Sebastian is giving his book talk. And we're sitting there, and a huge crowd filled up the tent. And we're worried, what did he decide to do? What is he going to do? And he walked out on stage, and he stood there in the middle of the stage, and very quietly, slowly, he started to sing. And he sang, "It's a long, long way to Tipperary." And the audience began to sob There were sobs. And I thought, why were we trying to help him? What was the point of that? It was just, he captured them immediately. It was an amazing moment. That's the story. Did I tell it right? That's true, right?
It's absolutely true. And then a little later, I'm worrying about events is part of the whole thing, and not sure, because you're like a horse who hasn't seen the jumps, so you have no idea what's going to happen out there in the arena. And I mean, the reason I took to you both, you and Jane, was you were so patient with my burbling fears. But the next day or day after, you were doing your event, and you had been given a vast tent to hold your audience. And as I passed by, not knowing it was you in there, I heard this rather terrified screaming. I mean, literally screaming. And I was wondering, should I be ringing 911 or what was going on? Some terrible event was taking place. And I looked in, and there were, of course, 900 children in there with you up on the stage, terrifying them to the limits of their ability to breathe in and out. And that was just a ravishing sight, really.
That's my job.
Then that's your job. And then I knew you were a considerable hombre in the world. And I have tried to hold on to you as a friend ever since.
Well, we've done very well.
That's why we're talking now, right?
Yes, right. That's why we're talking. So it's great. And I'm so happy about it. I saw online this film, they did a documentary about you called Family Stories.
Just 2 nights ago here in Ireland. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. And they have an excerpt. I was looking at it this morning, and you're walking in this excerpt. You're walking, some talking, a little talking, walking. Yes. Where were you walking?
In a place very sacred to me. It was when my sister was about 6 and I was 4. My mother and father went to London so he could find work as an architect. And they put us with our great aunt Annie in a little cottage in Kelshire in Wicklow, not very far from here. And I wrote a little book about that called Annie Dunn, although I don't name the children. And we had come out, I suppose, to some degree, I was the sort of battleground of my parents' marriage, I suppose. And it was the first time in our lives, I think, that my sister and myself felt completely safe, which is the first duty of the parent, isn't it, to make your child safe in the world. And for the documentary, and we were 9 months there. In fact, at the end of the 9 months, the 9 months only came to an end because my great aunt Annie had to write to my parents in London to remind them that they'd left their children there in Wicklow. So when, it is when we were doing the documentary, the director, Charlie McCarthy, said, would there be any chance of us going back to the house? Now, I had often been up there on the mountain walking, but carefully not disturbing my cousins in their lives and in their house. Indeed, whenever I was shortlisted for a Booker or whatever, I would go up there to placate the gods or ask the gods of childhood to help me with my fears, as usual. So I was obliged for the documentary to walk down towards the house. He filmed that. And then I knocked on the door, and my lovely, lovely cousins welcomed me in. And the beginning of the documentary is just me talking with them and saying who I am and why I was there. And he said, my cousin, Pat, who is about my own age, said, "Oh, I remember you when I was a little boy. I was 7 and you were 4. I remember you here in the yard," he said. And I asked him, "Well, what did you think of me as a little chap, a little boy from Dublin? Did you think I was very odd?" And he said, "I didn't think anything about you at all." He said, "You were far too young," because he was 7, you see. And that was the beginning. And the whole thing was a piece of magic. It was nothing to do with filming or a documentary, in some way to build you up or anything like that. It was just
Just
very,
just a wonderful moment.
yeah, it was like going to the center of your own heart.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And where does the film go from there?
Well, they showed it on our national channel there
Mhm.
2 nights ago, and I've no idea what happens to it now. Unfortunately, you can't really watch Irish television, I don't think, in America.
I don't know.
Maybe you can if you have a VPN or something, but it became mostly about uh, well, a little bit about the work, but also about my own family. The one I have accidentally made with Ali, my wife. We've been together for 37 years and we have 4 kids, and we're a bit proud of them. So
How
the
big,
document.
wait, how big an accident was that? What do you mean accidentally?
Well, I didn't expect even to be married, and you know, when you're a young writer, you've absolutely no money. I mean, no money. I remember the revenue commissioners got in touch with me, in fact, when I was a young writer, and said, "Why aren't you doing tax returns?" And I said, "Well, you know, because I have no money." And so and they thought I meant like $30,000 a year. They didn't understand the concept of zero income. Anyway, I was so poor that I thought, and I was very happy, you know, being a writer. I didn't mind in that sense, but I just never thought I could be married, you know, because you do need a few bob to do that, don't you, Bob?
Yes, you
But
do. Yeah,
you
you
know,
don't know, but you know, you're a writer, you keep going. I wrote for 20
yeah,
years, and no one noticed.
yeah, that's
For
it.
20
And that's
years.
the only advice you can give young writers is don't stop. If you know, if you can stop,
If you
well
want to
and
do
good.
it, keep going.
You'll improve your life a lot by not being a writer.
Right.
But
So wait, to get back, when did your parents come back?
well, they came back at the end of that year, and then we were transported via a primitive Aer Lingus in the days when you could be out on the tarmac drinking coffee or lemonade among the airplanes. I mean, it was very mysterious. And then, you know, a black taxi to our new abode in London, in Hampstead. So the change between intensely rural, poetic beauty of County Wicklow and London was very abrupt. But I think those abrupt changes in our experiences help us as writers. Oddly enough, as I'm talking to you, my daughter is texting me. So I'm going to
Yes.
stop doing that. Hold on. Oh my God. She's heard me giving talking nonsense, so she's trying to stop.
She's actually criticizing what you were just saying.
No, she's not listening. I don't think she
Oh,
knows.
she's
Oh my
not
God.
listening. Of course she's not listening.
She's still doing it.
They
Hold on.
don't listen.
Options. Let me just, oh my God. I don't know what to do now. Anyway, let's not panic. It's
All right.
rather sweet that she is texting me. So anyway, we had twins first, Carl and Merlin, and then 5 years later, Toby came, and then we have another girl, Hannah, who chose us, who's, you know, not an absolute birth daughter, but when she was 13, she was having a dreadful time in the world, and she chose us, and we adopted her basically by asking her what wallpaper she'd like in her bedroom. And once that was up, she was fine. She was our daughter.
That's a nice story. That's good. I have a feeling your childhood was very different from mine. Mine was my father unloaded trucks in a warehouse. He's a blue collar worker, and we were very poor. But you had your parents were illustrious. You had illustrious parents.
I
And
did. My mother was an actor in the Abbey Theatre, and a very, I mean, a very flamboyant and wonderful person in many ways. And when we were children, she could be a tremendous mother because she had a great sense of occasion. I mean, even picking mushrooms in a field for her was like a Homeric adventure, or going swimming at White Rock, which is a rocky beach in Killiney near where we were living. In fact, in Queenstown Castle, where this book is set, that's where we lived in the 60s for a while. And, you know, she'd lie out on the rock, and she was a very beautiful young person because she had us when she was 25. And then at the gates of the little school where I went to, they always thought she was my sister picking us up because she looked so young with long black hair. And my father had been a poet in his youth, and I suppose remained one and became an architect. I suppose I don't know if he certainly wasn't as illustrious as my mother, who really was a very respected and loved actor in the Irish theatre, and indeed was in a couple of my plays, which is quite difficult because my mother rather wonderfully, well, I'm probably imitating her now, never stopped talking. And when we were going to rehearsals, my only stipulation was, would you mind, ma'am, just not talking during rehearsals? And that was, I could see her suffering for the 6 weeks with the desire to speak.
Oh, wow. Wow. That's, yeah, very different from my parents.
Yeah.
But, and they understood. When did you start writing? When did you know you were a writer? You were young, right?
I still haven't quite got that news in my head, but this time still, I'm only 67. I think my first idea, I don't know if was that I would take over from Bob Dylan when he put down his guitar. You know,
Yeah.
I would go on from there, but he just never put his guitar
Never
down. So
did. Never
that
did.
there
But
was
I'm
no
saying
opening.
your parents understood. Like my parents had no, I'd be in my room typing. I started writing when I was 9. And
Yeah,
I'd be in my room typing. My mother would stand at the door. She'd say, "What's wrong with you?
yes.
What's wrong with you? Stop typing. Go outside and play."
But you know,
That's
Bob,
the worst advice I ever got, right?
but in a way, Bob, she was right, wasn't she? She was saying, "What's wrong with you?" Well, as laureate for Irish fiction, I asked 18 of my fellow writers here in Ireland on podcasts what it was called, "What the Hell Heaven Are We Doing?" And of course, no one knew, and we
No,
delighted in not finding out. But it is
right.
a very mysterious undertaking, and I'm not sure that there isn't something grievously wrong with us, although we may delight in our wrongness. Let's put it that way.
Well, that's it. Yeah, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. So I can't really picture you as a child.
Oh,
How would you describe yourself? What were you
crushing.
like?
I couldn't read. We were in London for that period when we followed on, and for some reason in an English school, I was very young, but I couldn't learn to read or write actually. I was about 7 or 8 when we came back to Ireland, and I was a very dreamy child, and I think rather not an unpleasant child, but dreaming. And in the little school I went to in Dalkey, well, the first thing I had to do was, because I'd been in London for a few years, I had an English accent, which in an Irish schoolyard is almost is a red rag to a bull. This person must be killed. So I very, very quickly learned how to speak as an Irish person again, which I also think was an important part of my writing career. And indeed, all our best research is done from the ages of 2 to 10, Bob. Let's face it. So in that school, I sort of they had this thing called the catechism, the Catholic catechism, which was really helpful to me because it had who made the world, God made the world. And these little words, these are the first little words I realized I could join them to sounds, God, and then the word I had in my head. And I think as a little boy, what characterized me was I saw language as a kind of physical thing floating in the air, with the words coming out of my great aunt's mouth seemed to me like a ticker tape, like a physical understanding of them, but that was nothing to do with reading or writing. So I was that sort of boy, whatever that's, there's a name for that in Irish, which means Shanimshra, and Shanimshra means old fashioned. And it's a boy of quaint manners. I don't know, Bob, were you in any way a child that could be described as Shanimshra?
Possibly. I was a very fearful child
Right.
and very shy. And my family was very poor, and we lived on the edge of a very wealthy community. And so I grew up feeling like an outsider. I had to wear my cousin's old clothes to school. I didn't have, in high school, everyone was driving around in Thunderbirds and we didn't have, so I grew up as an outsider. And I think that's one reason I was staying in my room and writing all the time.
Yeah. I think that characterizes a writer. This is why your mother wasn't too far off the mark, although it feels a bit cruel to say it to the child himself at that moment. I mean,
Yes.
like I say, our wrongness, in a way, we spent our lives transmuting by some alchemy our quaintness or our old-fashionedness into something highly charged and very positive, I think, because you're one of the most fearless people I know. And I think that characterizes you now. You could lead a large body of men and women into battle. I don't think you'd bat an eyelid.
Where do you get that?
I just think you're
Where
brave.
do you get that? Wait a minute.
I don't know. I like your courage.
What are you saying? I don't
Listen,
know.
any man who can
Listen, being a fearful child was lucky for me.
yeah,
Because, when I started writing these scary books, I could bring back that feeling of fear that I had. I could remember that feeling of panic of being a kid. It's a horrible way to be a kid, but I could bring that back and I could remember that. And I think that helped me a lot later on.
you were a connoisseur of fear. You knew what you were talking about.
I try.
Yeah. But any man who can stand up in front of 900 children, as far as I'm concerned, could lead an army into battle. That's what I mean.
Don't you love that part of this?
I love that part of it.
This part of your job?
Yeah, I do.
You're a performer.
And I was teaching recently as laureate at UCD, which is one of our universities, and I tried to teach my students that a large part of your life as a writer is going to be in front of audiences, and you should learn how to. I mean, you should even take the risk and sing to them, because singing is such a foolish act that immediately your audience will forgive you almost anything because you've been so ridiculous at the get-go. But they wouldn't have anything to do with that, Bob. They didn't want anything to do with performing. They just wanted to stand there timidly reading their work, which is a great disappointment to me. But I think you should give it what you have. And the great thing about writerly events, if you're reading, for instance, the bar is very low. You could just mumble and no one would mind. I mean, they're just sometimes not. It's nice to see a writer that you admire. So if you make a bit of an effort, I think it goes a long way.
Yes, yes. But I know a lot of authors, I'm sure you do, who hate to tour.
Yeah.
They hate to appear and they hate it.
Yeah.
It's one of the nicest things. People, for one thing, when you go on a book tour, people are so nice to you. Oh, I'm so happy to see you. Oh, thank you for, I don't get that at home. Right?
Of course not.
No.
I mean, it would be disastrous if you got that at home. But it's nice to go out. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, it's true.
I mean, if every time you came in with the milk from the shops and everyone was pleased to see you, that would be a bit awkward, I think.
Well, that's true. But yeah, that's a fun part, I think.
Yeah.
I hate it when authors come on conversations like this and it turns into a love fest and they just start telling each other how great they are.
Yeah, me too.
But I want to.
Let's do it anyway.
No, I'm going to say, I think a long, long way, I think, is the best World War I novel ever written.
Thank you.
I remember reading it for the first time. And that's why I'm thrilled to talk to you today. You're the only author I read. I read all the time. I read a lot, but I'm reading your book and I'll be reading along and then I'll have to stop and catch my breath. And I'll just stare at a sentence and say, how could anyone write that? I don't want to embarrass you or anything.
No, it interests me because
stare at it, and it actually takes my breath away, some of these sentences, some of what you write. And to me, that's not only a brilliant, but one of the saddest books ever written. I love that.
Well, that interests me only because, I mean, it's lovely to hear you say that, obviously, but just as I've got older, I have wondered, how you write a book, or how does it arrive, and what is it in essence. And I have to conclude that, I mean, the way I work, it's from a part of the brain that's not particularly connected to the educated bit at the top of your head, and that has all the university stuff. It's a very discrete, probably very ancient little room of the brain. I mean, it's very concentrated, and you're very poised, and you're seeing and hearing in a rather intense way, and that's how you make them. So in a sense, as the little boy who could neither read nor write, I'm still neither reading nor writing. I have learned the technique of taking down what I'm seeing and hearing, but I don't have any profound sense of making sentences in that sense. I'm just trying to paint it. I'm just trying to capture it, or rescue it from, the cold hand or the dark hand of things. Because if I don't write it down, it'll never exist. That sort of feeling.
Yeah.
And I've puzzled that out, and I've accepted it, because oftentimes, Bob, disgracefully in a way, when I'm like, for this book, Old God's Time, when I was proofing it, I noticed yet again, for the umpteenth time, that I didn't remember large tracts of it when I came to proof the book, because that part of the brain that's editing isn't necessarily very connected to the part of the brain that wrote the book in the first place, which I think is a bit of a mystery, and probably a bit scandalous, and probably a bit disreputable. But there it is.
No, it's two
6 or
different
7.
processes. Writing and editing are totally different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I don't know if writing is writing at all, and I don't know if the discipline
Now,
is
see,
actually
now I
writing.
think I'm trying to decide if you're just being modest.
No, I know I'm really trying to figure this out, because I also don't believe in, I don't believe in, I'm always a bit surprised when writers in themselves, even people who haven't read your books, think that being a writer is something special, or particularly worthy of attention. I'm not sure about that. I mean, everyone is worthy of attention, every human person. And part of what this book is about is people in childhood who are paying the wrong sort of attention to children. But children need attention, paid to them. And but it doesn't mean that your profession is in itself worthy of notice. I'm not being very clear about this, but
Yeah,
I don't think there are
I-
any pedestals, and I don't think there are any statues. I mean, at the same time, when the name R.L. Stine is invoked, I do feel a sort of sense of awe, and maybe a quiet sense that I would never communicate to you, of feeling really lucky just to know you. Like, I cherish our friendship in that sense. And so I understand the dynamic, of how people can sometimes feel about writers. But
Yes,
I
I do.
I just don't.
I cherish our friendship too.
Yeah.
But I think you and I, when it comes to writing, are totally opposites.
Oh,
'Cause I write, all my books are written just to entertain and nothing else. And you are the opposite. You have things you want to say, and I don't. I
I have
always
to
say,
say,
when,
I need to say, not rather than
yeah, I
want
don't.
to.
I
Yeah.
don't. I always hate it when authors go into a school and give a talk to the school and say, write what you know, everyone, write from your heart, write from your heart. And I know those kids will never write another word, right?
Mm,
And I
mm,
always tell kids, I've written over 300 books,
mm.
not a single word from my heart. It's all for fun. It's all to entertain kids, all to be entertaining and show kids
But
it's fun to read and nothing else.
Bob,
But see,
but
that's the opposite of what you do.
well, at the same time, a novel comes on. I mean, it's been particularly difficult to uh, to maintain this in the case of All God's Time, but a novel does come under the heading of entertainment, and there is there is a kind of responsibility to remember that. But in a book like this, for instance, where I have a character, Tom Kettle, who's a retired police officer, living in that very house, Queenstown Castle, where I was with my mother and my grandfather and my sister in the 60s. He allowed me to talk about the things that have troubled me most as a human person all my life, and troubled me most as a citizen of this country, part of which in this book is what they call rather vaguely clerical child abuse.
Mhm.
But I do feel the first responsibility that the object of a book, the actual physical statue quality of a book, is in essence to delight. Now, the problem with delight is you can also affright, or you can also inflame, or you can also enrage with a book. But I regard I have all those things under the heading of delight, because when you have a book in your lap, Bob, you know, that strange position, that's where you hold your babies, you know, in your lap, and that's where the books
That's
are
right.
held. And this thing is having an effect on you. It's rising up. Your eyes are drawing the book up from the page into your own brain, and you're having this essentially experience of being entertained, in the sense that entertainment means a profound noticing, you know. And
Yeah.
therefore, I think there's nothing outside the boundaries of a book. In this book, there are very difficult forensically, I mean, Tom is an ex-policeman, so forensically described instances of abuse. And I did have a thought, you know, my top brain was thinking, can you put this in a book? And my other part of the brain was saying, yes, but only because you must do it, only because you need to do that. You need to be clear about what you're talking about.
Yeah,
And
this is my question about this book.
yeah,
So where did it start? What
It's,
did you think where did you think you were going with it?
well,
How,
as usual, I had no
because
idea.
there's so much in it, and it
It's
goes
beautiful.
in so many different directions.
Well, you know, I live in the mountains here in Wicklow, among the forest, in the forest. There are many paths in the forest. And when you go up there with your dogs, whether you're running or walking, there are an infinite number of avenues you can go down. And I need that at the beginning of a book. So what I'm starting with in this book is something that happened to me when I was 7, that unreading, unwriting boy, and so wandering around the grounds of this faux Victorian castle in the 60s, and looking in through a door which I probably shouldn't have been looking into, and seeing a rather large gentleman sitting on a wicker chair in the middle of his room, his funny little flat that he had built onto the side of the castle. And he was looking out to sea with his back to me, smoking a cigarillo, you know, those little cigars. And he looked the utter picture of contentment, which was probably what attracted me as a little boy, the image of an adult at his ease, which I wasn't used to seeing.
Yeah.
And for some reason, Bob, I carried him with me for the next 60 years, thinking about him and knowing nothing about him. And I still know nothing about him, but I gave him, approaching this book, the name Tom Kettle. And you know, I had no idea, maybe around chapter 3, I was beginning to get a sense of the catastrophes that had been in his life, and of his brain beginning to unfold, this beautiful forensic policeman's brain coming apart because of huge pressures and stresses. These two guys from his old division, he's retired, but they come to ask him about a current case that has its roots in the 60s, in a case that he was in charge of, a thing he doesn't even remember. He's made himself forget even that. And he's made himself forget so many things, but the coming of these two men oblige him and confound him enough to start to remember everything, which is sort of his undoing. in the book, and that's what the book is about. But in another way, it's also the making of him, because when you're a survivor of terrible things, one of your methods, one of the methods people use is to hide everything from themselves, to bury it so deep. But it's not an entirely integral way to exist in the world. So if you have to face the demons, or the demons are dragged out in front of you and you have to look at them, there can be a kind of transcendent healing that takes place, or maybe not, but maybe. And so is he healed? He asks himself in the book, am I healed or am I ruined? He doesn't quite know which it is. So I didn't know at the beginning of the book anything about that. I was following it. I was literally watching through Tom's eyes what was happening in the book.
Started with this image of the man in the chair.
Yeah,
And
that's
when-
where it began.
here's a writer question.
Yeah.
Do you plan?
No.
Have you
Sometimes,
ever
like,
outlined or anything like that?
with a long way, I still, or maybe in my archive in Texas, in the Harry Ransom Center, there's probably a few pages because of written in this pen that I've had for Schaefer pen that I've had for 40 years, because I had to read. I couldn't make up the battles in the First World War. I thought that would be deeply irresponsible. So I did read as much as I could. And I had a note of some of those. Not that they did me any good, really, but I did sort of plan a little bit because it was 4 years of the war. And I had to be aware of the time frame and not be too fictional in that sense, but still remain 100% fictional. But this book, because it draws so from a well so buried, so deep in my own psyche, that I was obliged to pull up those buckets. That was my job. So you couldn't really plan, because frankly, Bob, you wouldn't know what the bucket would bring up until it was in the light and you saw the moon
writing it.
of water. Yeah.
Yes, right. Sebastian, did you pick out anything you would like to read from Old God's Time?
I want to be, yes,
I
because I want to be loving towards my readers and clear. Now, I am asking my readers, in a sense, to have the innate courage that they do have, reading some of the darker parts of the book, because my hope was, my secret prayer was, that in reading some of these details, that if you weren't a survivor yourself, you might take these images into your mind and carry them in your mind as an act of solidarity with survivors. This was my crazy thought. This is part of my prayer of the book. But it's also a book that describes intense happiness. Tom has absolutely adored his wife, June. And I just want to read one paragraph of the first time they sort of walk out together. I mean, it's almost nothing, but if you remember, Bob, I'm sure you do,
Yes.
your first moment walking out with Jane, it's just the absolute ravishing impossibility that this beautiful person would be having anything to do with you. And that's what this little paragraph is trying to say.
Wonderful.
So, and then there was the famous day, famous forevermore in his heart anyhow, when he and June went walking down into Monkstown on a sort of date, and went out far onto the pier there, where the summer grasses were left to grow like a long narrow meadow, and the sun was so hot on the wooden seats that the blue paint blistered. And they sat together, smelling the salted air that was stocked so thick with fishy smells, because just a few yards across the oily water was the stubby pier for the trawlers, the heroic fishermen of Dunleary, with their Wellington boots as creased as the skin of elephants and the boxes of otherworldly ice. They sat together, picking at the paint blisters with their fingers, June's bare legs covered in an almost imperceptible suggestion of downy hair, also something of a strange meadow, and her skin as brown as almonds, and her cotton dress on her trim form, and the crazily perfect face, as it seemed to him, someone so lovely he could barely breathe to think she was with him. Him, a mere copper of dubious extraction in his 30th year. The touch of her hand, not obviously like fire, but burning him all the same, burning his hand. So happiness too.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I think we should, on that note, answer some questions.
Definitely.
It would be our pleasure. Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation. We have a few questions specifically to each of you. So I'm going to start out with the first, which was there was great interest in the documentary that you mentioned, Family Stories. We understand there aren't easy ways to watch it. Is there anything else you can tell us about the documentary, because we are interested?
It's all, I don't know how many documentaries. Oh, Bob has been involved in many films and all the rest of it, but this was the first time I thought I could say yes to an idea like that. Not that I have been bombarded with suggestions of that kind, but I was a bit worried about it because in Ireland, and especially in the mountains here where I live, you can live beautifully anonymously. The people around here may know what I do, but I mean, their work is infinitely more important than what I do. They're farmers, they're sheep farmers, they're dairy farmers, they're carpenters. They do that important work that keeps the world turning. So they wouldn't be particularly elevating me. In fact, they probably, in a very friendly way, tolerate me as a sort of curiosity. And I'm really grateful for their loving attention in that way. But I was a bit concerned to in any way fracture that or dispel that, because in Ireland there's only 5 million people, and everyone watches the television. And I just thought, it was a risky thing to do. But the reason I decided to do it was when I met the director, Charlie McCarthy, and the producer, Cleona Nivukla. He had done a number of documentaries. He did one on Seamus Heaney just before he died, I think, and he had done one on John Banville. And I knew he was, a very sensitive person. And so he proved to be, because I also thought if he was going to concentrate on my family and my kids and the books in relation, because all the books come out of mostly that other family that I was born into, I thought it would be a record of this moment where, my twins are 30, my other boy is 25, Hannah's 31. I'm hopefully, I'm still running, but I'm 67, and Ali is as beautiful as ever. And I just thought it would be a nice thing to make. And so it proved, almost as a vademecum or a sort of aid memoir, something to look at, in 20 or 30 years as I teeter on the brink of perdition. I'd be so happy to have it, and they might be happy to have it. And in the film, Toby, my son, who's 25, and Days Without End, one of my other books, is dedicated to him, because when he was 15, he was very unhappy, having been an incredibly happy child. And I know, Bob, you have an amazing son as well. But the thing that was troubling him, even in a highly liberal family, where all sorts of very famous gay people were coming to the house, like Colin Tobin and all this. It was very normal. Much more normal to be gay than to be heterosexual, actually. But anyway, that's what was troubling Toby. He didn't know how to say those words that are so hard for a lot of young gay people, which is, the thing is, Dad, I'm gay. So in this film, he remembers that moment. He's now 25, and he's thinking back to that moment, and the moment of the referendum in Ireland. He wasn't quite old enough to vote for marriage equality. And I wrote this little letter to the Irish Times, thinking it was kind of a foolish letter. And I brought him into this very room where I'm talking to read it to him, just in case, because I wanted to send it to the Irish Times, to our newspaper. And he wept, and he's a very strong, kind of mensch-like young man. And the fact that he cried made me think maybe it was all right, because as Bob pointed out, the people crying is the only proof I have that the thing is any good. Anyway, rather than laughing or screaming. And anyway, so in this amazing film, I think, to me, amazing, overwhelming even, he talks about that to Charlie McCarthy. He's being interviewed, and my God, he says, you know, this was so important to him, this letter. And I'm sitting there 2 nights ago in the sitting room where I brought them up, listening to this child on the television saying this thing about his father, and then saying, "Thanks, Dad," he says, on national television. I mean, that I lived long enough to see that is all I can say. I mean, it was amazing, and kind of a life-affirming thing to do, as it turned out. I don't know what other people think about it, because I do talk in some detail about my own parents, and some of that's quite difficult. But everywhere I went today, of course, I went to buy some lengths of guttering, iron guttering, because there was a storm here and they fell off the roof. So I had to go and buy new ones. Well, I mean, even in this reclamation yard, 18 miles from the house, a woman came up and said, "Oh, you're Sebastian Barry." So then I was a bit worried about, you know, my God, oh my God, what have I done? But I'm glad I did it, and I'd love people to see it. And so, you know, it will be on some cable channel in America. And maybe if you're wicked enough and know how to do these VPNs that allow you to watch things in foreign countries, you'll get it on the RTE, is the name of our radio television share, and RTE iPlayer is where you would see it if you're allowed to see it. Maybe we should, I mean, maybe Americans can see it, and maybe Americans ought to be able to see it, considering there's 40 million Irish people. Why can't they see their national TV station?
Good point. Good point. I can't.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. There is a lot of interest, so we'll see what we can do. So
Oh,
thank you. That
good.
was
Work your
wonderful.
magic.
Yes. RL, the next one is for you. The question is it therapeutic and or cathartic for you to have a sense of control over your fears through your writing?
Not something I would ever think about, but I know I feel good that a lot of my readers have that feeling. I was talking to a child psychologist in Los Angeles, and he was telling me about a patient he had, a girl who would just come in every week and replay a plot from one of my Fear Street books. And he said she was reliving her fears and she was overcoming her fears by reading these scary books and by, you know, coming to the successful end of the books. So I don't know what it's done for me, but it was nice to hear that, you know, it's been helpful to readers.
Excellent. Well, I'm going to keep going because we have more questions. So this one back to Sebastian. I'm going to read it word for word. The reader says, "I'm halfway through the book, so don't give it all away. Here's my question. Is the topic of the behavior of priests in the old days and how it was, quote, tolerated, still of interest in 2023 Ireland? Or are young people beyond such interests and only of interest to those of us who lived through it?" He mentions that he was fortunately protected by loving parents, but even though he's no longer living in the old side.
I know that's an amazing question. And, you know, I wish the answer was, you know, it's of no interest at all, because it's all in history and it's all gone by. But the problem with this problem is that it won't go by. Part of my reason for writing the book is really, if I just, as one person writing one book, could create a tiny, tiny tincture of extra vigilance in us in the care and protection of our children, then I would have done at least, or tried to do, a good thing. But only a few weeks ago, the book was written at the end of 2021, you know, then it goes through a long period of rewriting. Just a few weeks ago in our national papers and airwaves, some old boys of Blackrock College, which was supposedly our best school, the president of that school in days gone by was in fact Archbishop John Charles McQuaid, who in this novel is probably the slightly demonic figure, I suppose. Anyway, these older boys who are now my age, one of them finally spoke, finally found that angelic space in which to speak about something that had happened to him at the school. Soon dozens and dozens of former pupils were coming out to speak about their experiences, and truly terrifying experiences. As it stands, 74 priests have been named in this respect. So this tendency to say it's in the priesthood, it's a few bad apples, but actually in Ireland at least, which is the country I might know a little bit about, having read all the reports, it's half the barrel. I mean, what's happening in that barrel of apples? There must be some ghastly cider being fermented, really. And it is terrifying, therefore. No, well, terrifying, yes, but also, again, instilling anew a sense of vigilance, because any child, in all truth, and I'm speaking now into the hearts and minds of who is ever listening, and that beautiful questioner, any child now who's being harmed, we probably won't hear about that child's ordeal for 20, 30, 40 years, because it takes so long. And it's exactly what happens to Tom Kettle in the book. It has to surface in order for there to be speech. So we won't know. I mean, Bob and I probably will probably not know in our lifetimes. But if you can find that part of your brain that is vigilant and just be more powerfully aware of the danger children are always in, it's never history. It just isn't. It's a dangerous, dangerous part of the sort of creature we are. So, as I said earlier, I feel the first duty of the parent, and maybe of the citizen, and maybe of the human creature, is to preserve the safety of the child. So, I mean, that's my answer to the question. It's not just of interest, but I think it's of urgent import. You know, it's news that stays news, as Ezra Pound said about poetry. And we will always need to hear the testimony of survivors, the detailed forensic, particular visual testimony of survivors, in order to function better as a human creature and maybe pass over into a slightly better state of being.
A great deal for us to think about. Thank you very much for that answer. I am going to move along so we can fit in some more questions. Very different style of question, very specific. And it says, who owns the castle now? Is it still there in private ownership?
I was just there with a BBC crew who are doing it's going to be part of a book club on BBC Two. So we went there with the crew. I was a bit afraid that it wouldn't be as beautiful as I remembered it. It was far more beautiful than I remembered it. I did look into that because we were a bit worried. Could we go onto the grounds? Would they be very angry with us? It's certainly not owned anymore by the landlord that I describe in the book. I believe it's owned by the people who own, it's now in apartments. And I think it's owned by a committee of those people. But so it's not in any one single ownership. It was built in 1860 by one person, I suppose, as a testament to his glorious succession in life, or procession through life. But now it's in its modern guise. It's a group of people. But you know, again, in those magical rooms, looking out over that magical vista, looking out at the cormorants. There's a scene in the book where the man next door is actually shooting at the cormorants with a long distance rifle on his balcony. That's something I actually witnessed as a child in the 60s. The man next door actually did that, but thank God that's forbidden now, because the birds can be out on the rocks in peace.
Wonderful. I'm going to turn right over to RL and say, can you tell us about this? The reader says, I heard that Goosebumps Slappy World is ending. What is the Goosebumps House of Shivers series going to be about?
How did they find out about that? I'm amazed by what people know. We're changing the name to Goosebumps House of Shivers next year, and it will be the same stories. It'll be Goosebumps with a new name.
Very good.
Simple.
Back to you, Sebastian.
Every once in a while we change, we try to freshen it up.
I'm going to retitle all my novels and reissue them as new books.
Yes, I
Of
advise
Stine.
that.
Okay, Sebastian, for you, it says, the reader says you write with such vivid, beautiful descriptions from what you read from one of your books. What advice would you give to an aspiring writer who has a weakness for writing description?
I think your first duty as a writer is to truly to forget about writing. You need to wait till you feel that there's something maybe inchoate, something unwritten, something, well, obviously unwritten, gathering in your mind. And then your job is to see that and hear that. And yes, use the technique of writing in order to notate that and try and make a faithful representation of that, like you would in a piece of music. Just take down the notes, as it were. But I see the job of the writer not so much as writing. And let's think of the job of writing as what the Scots called the makar. Before there was writing, Homer, or the people who make up Homer, was using performers to remember his lines and to remember his stories so that they could be spoken on the air. And I think a writer will do well to think of them first as object, as story, whatever, is an object that floats on the air, and then worry later when you're doing your rewriting about the actual writing. That's the only thing I know about it. And it could be dreadfully misleading for the questioner, because that mightn't work for them at all. In which case, forgive me.
Very good. Well, we have kudos to both of you. We will have to wrap up with one last question. So I would like to say, for RL, you have a big fan of the Fear Street books. And since they were a teenager, he's now 37. And for Sebastian, you have someone whose mother's maiden name is Barry. We can send these on, but they're loving this talk and they think it's terrific. The last question we have is, to volunteer with kids here in the US, you have to pass a check to make sure you have no criminal record and 2 adults have to be present, etc. What measures are in place in Ireland? And this will be our last question for today.
We have exactly the same thing. The Gardaí, in fact, Tom Kettle has been a Gardaí all his life. He's a retired policeman. You have to be vetted in order to go into certain spaces, even not just children's spaces, but also hospitals. When I was laureate for Irish fiction, I had to go through a vetting process when I was going into dialysis units with my book club. I went into the Central Mental Hospital, where you're not guilty by reason of insanity. Some of the most lovely people I've ever met in my life were in there. But in order to go in there, you had to be vetted by the Gardaí. But I mean, there is no vetting process in my mind that can truly guarantee the safety. That's why I say, vigilance is the only thing I can think of is a kind of hypervigilance in that matter. But we do have that process here, yes, for sure.
Very good. Very good. I know, along with the readers, we give our thanks to you, Sebastian, and to RL. Please, everyone, consider purchasing your copy of Old God's Time from R.J. Julia, Wesley and R.J. Julia in Bookhampton. Links are sent to you in the chat box. Thank you so much for joining us here today, and thank you again. Goodbye, everyone.